Today's video is about a city whose history reflects long-term attempts to defend the country's independence in confrontation with a stronger neighbor surrounding the territory from the north and east.
We hope that this story contains useful lessons.
As in previous days, many road signs point to Spain.
That is why such a fortified settlement should have appeared here.
Elvas is a frontier fortress displaying the style of military architecture with star-shaped forts.
It is considered the largest fortified bastion in the world.
Star-shaped fortresses replaced the medieval fortification we encountered in Monsanto, Castelo Branco or Marvao.
The bastion system was used both in the construction of relatively small forts and in urban defensive structures.
In Elvas, we see both of these examples. Bastions surround the city itself, and forts are present in the north and south.
Here at the Foreign Visitors View YouTube channel, we continue to tell you about our trip around Portugal.
We are your guides,
Konstantin Krasovsky,
and Tatiana Andreeva.
We are moving from the north of Portugal.
There we have already seen Guimarães, Chaves, Bragança, Miranda do Douro, Guarda, Belmonte, Monsanto, Edania Avelia, Castelo Branco, and Marvao.
So we approach first the northern fort, which is called Nossa Senhora da Graça Fort.
Graça in Portuguese is an extremely polysemantic word. It is not only grace in English, which can be synonym for elegance, beauty, mercy, and compassion.
It is also humor, joy, and even a joke.
The fort is named Graça after the hill of the same name on which it is located.
And Nossa Senhora is how the Virgin Mary is called in Portuguese.
However, let's look at the history of Elvas as a concentrated reflection of the relations between the two countries of the Iberian Peninsula chronologically.
Spain and Portugal, of course, had a common past called Reconquista, that is, conquering the territory of the peninsula from the Arabs.
However, the principalities of Aragon, Galicia, Castile, Leon, and Navarre formed Spain.
And the Principality of Portugal became a separate state.
Elvas Castle dates back to the period of Arab rule on the Iberian Peninsula, although the main tower and many buildings were erected later.
This is the highest place. From here, you can clearly see the walled city and forts to the north and south.
The castle was captured from the Moors in 1166 under Afonso I and then recaptured again in 1226 under Sancho II.
It is believed that it was under Sancho II that Elvas began to develop as a complex of fortifications, first based on those built by the Arabs. These Arab walls are still found here and there in the city.
Military patterns are seen everywhere here, even in the water supply and in the construction of churches.
Largo de Santa Clara, a small triangular square that attracts tourists, ends with a 10th century Arab gate. The gate is flanked by two towers on both sides and a gallery at the top.
There is also a beautiful Manuelian-style pillory, traditional for Portuguese cities, and it is even decorated with dragon heads used for hanging miscreants.
The Dominican church, overlooking the same square, returns us to the Moorish theme.
From the outside, it looks like a single-nave Gothic church, but look at how the dome is made, the characteristic arcs, and the predominance of floral patterns inside. They seem more expected in a mosque.
But this is not necessarily the influence of the Arab period. During the age of great geographical discovery, Spain and Portugal were the only two powerful maritime states that divided the globe.
The numerous colonies that belonged to Portugal are referred to by the monument to combatants who fought in overseas territories. It was opened in 2008 near the entrance to the fortress.
These overseas territories served as a source of inspiration for architects who worked during the reign of King Manuel I to create the so-called Manueline style, which traditionally includes pillories of various shapes.
Since Portugal was actively present in Western Africa and Portuguese colonies existed in the territory of present-day Morocco since the 15th century, Moorish motifs are seen in the architecture of several churches.
Not far from the castle is the Church of the Third Order of St. Francis. Although it was built in the 18th century and in the Baroque style, pay attention to the peculiar dome, which reminds us of other architectural traditions.
Architects who developed the Manueline style also worked during the reign of Manuel's son, João III, who continued to expand the colonial possessions and to develop trade relations with different countries.
But many important projects were also implemented within the country during his reign.
Both from the Graça hill and moving along the road from the northern fort to the city, we observe the majestic structure. This is an aqueduct connecting the eastern Portuguese border town of Elvas with the water sources further to the west.
This is also relevant to the military history of Portugal, because the border fortress needed a reliable water supply.
When people say the word aqueduct, they often add the word Roman. This era is often repeated in the connection to the city of Évora, located near Elvas.
But this is not a Roman aqueduct.
Both of them were built between the 15th and the 17th centuries.
In Évora, the construction ended much earlier, in 1537. In Elvas, it took 120 years and was completed only in 1622.
Both of them were designed by the architect Francisco de Arruda, the court architect during the reign of King João III, who commissioned the construction. His most famous work is the Belém Tower in Lisbon.
Unlike the longer but single-tiered aqueduct in Évora, the aqueduct in Elvas has 4 tiers of arcs.
It is called Aqueduto da Amoreira, which is a mulberry aqueduct, perhaps because the 843 arches are shaped like mulberries.
Another version explaining the name is that the aqueduct begins in the settlement called Amoreira. However, a town with this name can be found on the shores of the Atlantic Ocean, whereas the origin of the aqueduct is in several kilometers from the border with Spain.
Currently, the aqueduct carries water to the marble fountain at Largo da Misericordia. Earlier, of course, it supplied water to the entire city and its garrison.
This same architect, Francisco de Arruda, built the church in Elvas, which was a cathedral until 1882, when Elvas was the center of the diocese. Igreja da Nossa Senhora de Assunção is considered a fortified church.
It is classified as late Gothic, but features elements of the Manueline style and Moorish motifs.
Like many buildings in Elvas, the church looks like a fortress, especially its bell tower.
The city center is also surrounded by fortified walls with 7 pentagonal bastions.
Both the walls surrounding the city center and the nearby Fort Luzia were built in the 17th century during the Portuguese Restoration War, in accordance with the Dutch fortification system then developing in Europe.
Let's look back into the events that preceded this war, called the Portuguese Restoration War. As with other kingdoms and principalities of the Iberian Peninsula, the Castilian kings repeatedly tried to take over Portugal.
After the end of the Burgundian dynasty in 1383, An attempt to seize Portugal by Juan of Castile was unsuccessful.
Several Portuguese kings managed to maintain their sovereignty through advantageous political alliances and dynastic marriages.
However, such marriages could result in applicants being descendants of both Spanish and Portuguese kings. In 1580, another dynastic crisis led to the emergence of the Iberian Union and the seizure of power in Portugal by the Habsburgs dynasty.
Although the idea of close languages and fraternal peoples initially suited the Portuguese elites, it gradually became clear that Portugal began to lose its position both within the country and in overseas territories.
Several popular uprisings were suppressed, but gradually the Portuguese elites united around the Duke of Bragança.
They proclaimed him João IV.
But since the Bragança dynasty was not recognized by the Spanish crown, the 28-year Spanish-Portuguese War began in 1640.
To end the long confrontation and restore independence, Portugal undertook various strategies,
including building fortifications, which we can still see today in Elvas.
Military engineers concluded that the old fortress walls of Elvas could not provide sufficient protection.
The Dutch mathematician, military engineer, and architect Jan Tiermans or Johannes Tiermans, also known in Portugal as João Pascasio Cosmander or simply Cosmander, was invited by the Portuguese King João IV to work in the country in the position with the rank of Colonel of Engineers of the Portuguese army.
He participated in the design and construction of several fortresses in different parts of Portugal, around Lisbon, in Alentejo, around Elvas.
The Elvas fortress is considered a masterpiece of his engineering art, as well as a continuation of the school of mathematicians and architects in the Netherlands, including Flemish Simon Stevin and Dutch Samuel Malloys.
Noteworthy, Cosmander is usually mentioned as a member of the Jesuit order. This story is apparently not unique. An entire monograph chapter was written about the participation of Jesuits, who achieved success in mathematics, in helping Catholic rulers design fortifications to fight Protestants and Muslims.
The use of Dutch technology is also surprising because the Iberian Union, including Spain and Portugal, had been at war with the Netherlands since 1598, as a result of which Portugal lost some of its colonies.
However, ties between Portugal and the Netherlands existed before the Iberian Union, as Portuguese merchants used the Netherlands as a base to sell spices from Portuguese Asian colonies to Northern Europe.
Returning to military architecture, presented in Elvas in abundance, the need for changes arose due to the fact that after the advent of artillery, the vertical walls and towers of medieval fortresses could not withstand shelling.
All over Europe, military architects began to build the walls lower and thicker, sometimes even made of earth and only covered with stone.
Instead of towers, pentagonal bastions began to be erected. They eliminated the problem of dead zones of medieval fortresses.
The earthen rampart between the bastions, called a curtain, was often supplemented by a moat with or without water.
Since the curtain was a target for enemy artillery, it was protected by ravelins, triangular fortifications placed forward and often surrounded by water.
Let's look into what is known about the origins of such architectural solutions.
Some authors call star forts the Dutch fortification system and refer to Fort Bourtange in the province of Groningen, built in 1593.
Others write that the bastion fortification system is also called the Italian outline and refer to the Venetian fortress Palmanova.
Built according to the design of Vincenzo Scamozzi in the same 1593.
However, the Palmanova fortress has the shape of a 9-pointed star with 9 bastions but without ravelins. Perhaps this is the difference between the Italian outline and the Dutch fortification system.
Although at subsequent stages of construction Palmanova acquired 9 ravelins, this happened already by the time of the Napoleonic Wars.
But some researchers refer in their papers to what was developed in Portugal as the Metodo Lusitanico in military architecture.
Anyway, we see that the ability to invite proper experts was another strength of Portugal.
The outer walls of Elvas are equipped with both pentagonal bastions and triangular ravelins.
However, the city did not get a star shape, since the fortifications surrounded the existing buildings on the hill.
Also, several fortresses located around Elvas, along the border with Spain, have the shape of incomplete stars.
These are Campomayor, Oguela, Olivença, and Romania.
A fortress with a proper 4-pointed star shape was built south of Elvas, Forte de Santa Luzia.
This is a star with 4 bastions, 3 ravelins, and 1 gate.
The fort is surrounded by a moat with karst depressions in the underlying rock.
The building inside the fortress, the citadel, is now an army museum.
It shows collections of weapons, uniforms, as well as details of the battles that took place here.
Both the fortifications around Elvas and Fort Santa Luzia were built during the Portuguese War of Restoration.
Historians mention several important episodes.
In 1644, Elvas withstood a 9-day siege by Spanish troops. In 1659, the so-called Battle on the Lines of Elvas took place.
The town Elvas was chosen due to the fact that its garrison threatened the Spanish city of Badajoz, located 8 kilometers to the east, which we already mentioned in the video about Marvao and the man who gave it his name.
The Spanish king Philip IV decided to capture a strategically important Portuguese position near Elvas and lure out the Portuguese army, which would come to the aid of the blocked garrison. Count Antonio Luis de Menezes gathered an army in Extremas, which we will talk about next time, and moved to the aid of Elvas.
The Portuguese army occupied the hills northeast of Elvas, from where the city and enemy positions were visible.
The Spanish troops were trapped and many were forced to surrender.
Antonio Menezes' contribution to Portuguese history was commemorated on the 20 escudo banknote.
Nevertheless, the Portuguese Restoration War didn't end there yet, but continued until 1668, when the Treaty of Lisbon was concluded.
Further significant events involving this fort unfolded at the beginning of the 18th century in connection with the War of the Spanish Succession. This time, a dynastic crisis befell the Habsburgs, leading to a major war in several theaters of war.
In April 1706, Spanish and French troops attacked Elvas as part of the War of the Spanish Succession, but failed to take the city. In 1712, a siege by the Marquis of Bay took place, but these troops were battered by the fort's artillery.
And in the second half of the 18th century, a 7-year war occurred. We already told about Portugal's participation in this war in our video about Miranda do Douro.
Experience in the Portuguese Restoration War and the battle on the lines of Elvas showed that the enemy tended to occupy the hills near the city.
Therefore, it was decided to build a fortress, Nossa Senhora da Graça Fort, on such a high hill, Monte da Graça, north of Elvas.
This fort is also called Conde de Lipa, or La Lippe. This name is associated with the Count William von Schaumburg-Lippe.
Because Lippe had distinguished himself as an outstanding artillery general while fighting on the side of Prussia during the 7 Years' War, the Marquis de Pombal, the Portuguese foreign minister, invited him as generalissimo to command the combined forces of Portugal during the Spanish invasion.
We talked about the first stage of this invasion in May-November 1762 in more detail in our video about Miranda do Douro.
Interestingly, the invading army was Franco-Spanish troops, and they were opposed by the Anglo-Portuguese army.
By the way, it was the allied relations with Britain that were a powerful factor in the success of Portugal in confronting Spain at all times, starting with the Treaty of Windsor in 1386.
Some of our viewers may be interested to hear that the rhetoric of the Spanish ultimatum to Portugal included a desire to defend and liberate Portugal from British oppressors.
A second invasion attempt was made through the province of Lower Beira, where Castelo Branco is located, which we have already described, and the goal was to reach Lisbon, but again, without success.
The third attempt was the attack on the province of Alentejo, since the Spaniards counted on the weakness of the garrisons in Elvas, Marvão, and some others. Count Lippe reorganized the Portuguese army and, among other things, developed plans for a fortification system at Elvas.
It is believed that the northern fort of Elvas became an almost exact copy of the Wilhelmstein fortress, the construction of which Lippe supervised in 1761. Work on the construction of the fort began in 1763, that is, the year of the 7 Years' War ended, and the fort was opened in 1792.
Now, the northern fort is a place that attracts tourists, for whom several parking lots have been organized.
There are also parking areas for cyclists, for whom riding up this hill is a worthy exercise.
The outside of the fortress is surrounded by a wide moat.
And the earthen ramparts are a natural continuation of the hill.
The fort is a quadrangle, at the corners of which there are pentagonal bastions with buildings and fortifications.
The center of each curtain, that is, wall between the bastions, is protected by triangular ravelins, on which no special structures are now visible, except for watchtowers.
The watchtowers are located along the entire perimeter of the fortress, especially at the corners of the bastions and ravelins.
On the side of the ravelin closest to the road is the only gate of the fortress.
However, we received New Year greetings here and were informed that we would not be able to visit the fort.
Therefore, we could only take a photo of the gate through the bars.
In addition to the central structure in the shape of an octagonal star, the fortifications also continue in the northeast direction, from where the Spanish attacks were more frequent.
Such structures called semi-bastions, lunettes, and redoutes were widely used in the fortresses of the 16th, 19th centuries.
In the center of the fort, there is a two-story citadel with a chapel.
It is clearly visible both from the city and from the southern fort of Santa Luzia.
Inside the hill below the citadel, there is a huge water tank.
It was reported that the volume of this water tank would be enough for a garrison of 2,000 people for 2 years.
Note the holes around the perimeter of the entire fortress, apparently designed specifically to allow rainwater to constantly collect in the cistern. Using best current technologies and inviting the best specialists for this are also important lessons taught by the history of Portugal.
Fort La Lippe was used during the so-called Orange War of 1801.
However, to discuss these events, we invite you to move again to the fortress surrounding the central part of Elvas.
We enter the city through a gate called Porta de Olivença, decorated with various symbols of military valor.
Olivença is the name of a town south of Elvas.
Olivença has belonged to Portugal since the Treaty of Alcanis in 1297.
We discussed this treaty in our video about another city on the border between Portugal and Spain, Miranda do Douro.
Olivença became part of Spain as a result of the Orange War in 1801.
During this war, the Spaniards, this time in alliance with Napoleonic France, once again undertook a siege of 4 Portuguese border garrisons, which defended with varying degrees of success.
We walk along Olivença Street and soon find ourselves in Republic Square. Let us remind that the Republic of Portugal was proclaimed in 1910 as a result of a revolution, or coup d'etat.
There are several interesting objects on the square. The clock tower on the white building on the left is called the Clock of Republic Square, Relógio da Praça da República.
This white building itself, with a beautiful gallery, was built back in 1538 by the same architect Francisco de Arruda.
And now it houses a cultural center.
In the center of the same square, there is an installation for everyone to show love for this city.
A little further is the church Igreja de Nossa Senhora da Assunção, which we have already talked about.
Next to it are Christmas and New Year installations.
And there is even a kiosk on the square.
If you walk east from the Republic Square along Lorenzo Street,
an unexpected-looking structure emerges, which turns out to be the fountain of Saint Lorenzo too.
And then the Church of San Lorenzo, built in the 13th or 14th century, rebuilt in the 15th, 17th and 19th centuries.
Next we discover the Baroque facade, added in the 17th century, of the church, which was rebuilt several times.
It belongs to the church and monastery of Saint Domingo, located near the southeast edge of the fortress. And this church also looks like a fortress.
The church was built in the 13th century in Gothic style, and this can be seen from its chancel visible from outside the fortress.
Next to this church, the area inside the moat is used as a military museum.
A variety of military equipment is exhibited here. However, it belongs to later historical eras than those discussed so far.
Going back to the early 19th century, just to the north near the eastern border of the fortress is the so-called English cemetery, where British soldiers are buried. They died here in 1811 and 1812 during the Peninsular Wars of 1807 to 1814 as part of the Napoleonic Wars in the area of the towns of La Albufera and Badajoz.
This time, unlike all other wars, Spain, Portugal and Great Britain fought together against Napoleonic armies.
This cemetery was established because the British soldiers could not be buried next to Catholics.
As usual, a few notes on logistics.
To stock up on groceries and explore the city, we leave the car in the parking lot near the Lidl supermarket.
Since we try to share travel tips with our viewers as well, let's mention that Lidl proved to be very helpful during this trip.
Initially, we planned to dine in pre-selected restaurants that suited our dietary preferences or restrictions, but it quickly became clear that such a waste of time didn't fit with our busy schedules.
In addition, not all vegetarian restaurants selected in advance actually exist, and in some countries they are rather rare.
In most of the towns we visited, the Lidl supermarket could offer a suitable range of products for both dinner and lunch.
There was usually a working toilet there.
And in some places, as in Elvas, it was also within walking distance of the sites we came to see.
Therefore, we recommend using this opportunity to leave your car in the supermarket parking lot and get acquainted with the city in the meanwhile.
And then we go to Vila Viçosa, Extremos and other cities in the southern part of Portugal.
Therefore, subscribe to the channel, put thumbs up and share the video with your friends.
Your guides were with you
Konstantin Krasovsky.
and Tatiana Andreeva.
See you in the next city or country.